A couple things about pawpaw flowers. They're a bit hard to photograph, and they're not pollinated by bees, but rather flies and other native insects. I'm Austin Cliff, and that's my blurry hand, and we're looking at blurry footage of pawpaw flowers in my backyard. The footage we're seeing here was shot on an older phone, but even modern phone cameras can have trouble picking up the small, dark, downward hanging flowers of Asimina triloba. With some diligence, I was able to get better footage, and we'll see that in a bit. In my last video, I made a travel log of the various pawpaw trees that residents are growing in Pawpaw, Illinois. I was able to return to Pawpaw, Illinois for the Pawpaw Garden Club's Spring Fling plant sale with some seeds and seedlings, and I was able to talk with folks there about pollinating pawpaw flowers, which are in bloom at this time of year. The sale was a great success despite the cool, rainy, windy weather we were having that day. I got to talk to a lot of pawpaw growers, both new and old. The sale was very well organized, and the organizers even invited me to give a brief speech on pollinating pawpaws. I had hoped to use footage from my speech for this video, but it just didn't work out that way. I did, however, get a bit more footage of the pawpaw trees of Pawpaw, Illinois that were not featured in the last video, and we'll see some of that at the end of the video. To help illustrate pollinating pawpaws, however, we'll turn to footage I got in my backyard. Here in my backyard, I've got pawpaw seedlings tucked away between two garden beds in 4x4 by 14-inch deep pots from Stewie and Sons. These deep pots are pretty standard and allow a taproot to form. To protect the taproot from freezes and thaws over the winter, I place a hay bale at either end of this row of pawpaws. The small trees begin to leaf out around the last frost, and we had a warming period before our late last frost, which resulted in some of this browning that you see. It is all superficial damage, though, and the trees seem to have bounced back well. The mature trees are also just beginning to leaf out, but they are also blossoming at this time. And these blossoms can also suffer frost damage, as you see here. Not all of the blossoms will be out by the time the frosts are over with, however, so even if some suffer some damage, there will likely be enough for fruit set. Here we see, I think, a secondary flower bud emerging after one that got some frost damage, but I'm not exactly sure. That's what an early emerging flower bud looks like, and here's a somewhat matured flower beginning to get its color. There too appears to be a possible secondary flower bud at the base of this flower. I'm not 100% certain though, and I'm sure folks will let me know in the comments. Here we see the petals opening and the inside parts of the flower beginning to mature. I'm not sure if this is yet receptive to pollen, but it soon will be. This next flower is a little further along. It has more color, it's open wider, and you can see the stigma maturing inside. That's what looks like the gathering of fingertips like you might make while doing a bad Italian accent. The green part right in the center there. As pawpaw flowers mature, they first reach this female stage where they are receptive to pollen. At the time of this video, most of the flowers on my trees were either just beginning to open or were just reaching this female stage of development. Later, the yellow brain-like dome you see behind the stigma, called the anthers, the male part of the flower, will mature and shed tiny yellow pollen grains. Once the flowers reach that male stage, the stigma will no longer be receptive to pollen, and the anthers will be brown and crumbly with pollen grains everywhere. This fall's fruit harvest is now but a glimmer in the eye of this tree's female flower. It is open, fully colored, and its glistening stigma looks highly receptive to pollen. One thing I forgot to mention about pawpaw flowers is that they generally need to receive pollen from another genetically dissimilar tree to set fruit. The first tree that we saw was tall enough to be bearing fruit, but this tree is maybe a little young even though it's flowering. Pawpaws begin to flower when they reach about human height. This tree is flowering for the first time this year. I may collect pollen from it for pollination, but I don't think I'll allow it to set fruit because the fruit weight may stress my graft, which we can see here. But grafting is a subject for another video. The question for this video is, how does pollen from one tree's flower manage to get to another tree? Didn't your parents ever tell you about the flies and the beetles? That is not quite what I meant. Okay, there's definitely some pollinating going on in there, but how does one do as the flies and beetles do, so to speak, and really move that pollen from one tree to another in order to get fruit set? Smelly, lazy people like me will just move their composter over by the big tree and let the flies and beetles take care of it. But artsy farts, also like me, will dig through their toolbox of Pawpaw paraphernalia and find a small makeup or paintbrush. Then they'll close their eyes. Go ahead, I'm waiting. All right. Then they'll envision a fly. Really channel its energy. I don't know, get all horny and start rubbing your hands and feet together. All right. Open your eyes. Poof! You're a fly.
Help me! Help me!
Your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to fly off and go find a male flower that's shedding pollen. Here we go. You'll want to coat your tiny, hairy abdomen with pollen grains, just like this guy. Now, if you're not method, a paintbrush will do. Here we go. Pollen acquired. Take a moment to admire your pollen-coated abdomen. Make sure you're nice and loaded. Now it's time to fly off to another tree and find a female flower that is currently receptive to pollen. Simply follow your proboscis to that slightly fetid, yeasty smell of a receptive female flower on another tree. Why? Do my compound eyes deceive me? No, it's a receptive female flower. Time to get out your hairy abdomen and rub it all over that stigma, really packing that pollen on there. And like any good fly, after your work is done, make sure you've really adhered those pollen grains to that sticky stigma. Job well done. I think you've earned some rest and relaxation. Time to go find a dog turd. We receive quite a variety of insect visitors to the pawpaw flowers in my backyard, and they seem to be doing pretty well at doing the pollinating for me. But let's say you have two specific exceptional trees that you'd like to breed together and have seedlings that are their offspring. You'd need to deliver pollen from tree A to a receptive flower on tree B that has not yet been pollinated by any other tree and prevent any other pollen from reaching that flower. The resulting seeds will be offspring of those two trees. So here we are in my backyard. We're seeking pollen. Can you see it in there? Easy does it. So we're going to attempt to do a controlled cross. This is my favorite seedling of mine. We're calling it PC3 for now. I'm going to take my brush and load it up with as much of this pollen as I can, and then try and pack the stigma on a receptive flower on a branch of Tollgate, which was my award-winning fruit last year. Alright, so here's our receptive Tollgate blossom. So, some people will pollinate a flower, and you're looking for one that's receptive to pollen, that hasn't received pollen yet. It didn't seem like this one had yet received pollen because the stamen wasn't packed with it. Stigma, rather, not stamen. So, we're just trying to pack this one as much as possible. And honestly, I don't know if multiple passes help or hurt it, but the idea is to not have any other pollen get into that stigma, so that any seeds produced will be across of those specific trees. Some people will bag the flowers to keep it from getting any other pollen, but this one I'm just going to assume that since I packed it on there really well, there's not going to be much more room for other pollen, and that's taking a cue from Neil Peterson's website. So we'll see what happens. Here is a close-up of that flower, and we're just checking my work to make sure that those stigmas are loaded with the pollen that I delivered, and it looks to be the case. I've marked the branch with this specific flower using a zip tie, and I'll keep an eye on the other buds on that branch. Soon you'll start to see fruitlets form, and the peduncle will start to stand erect if pollination has occurred. That's what looks like is going on here, though it may suffer from June drop later, so we'll just have to monitor its progress and wait and see. So as promised, we're going to end with some footage of pawpaw trees in Pawpaw, Illinois that I forgot to include in the last video. These two trees belong to the Prentices, who live on Maple. They are a couple of beautiful mature trees that put out quite a bit of fruit. I believe they got them from a mail-order nursery, if I recall correctly. They were nice enough to share some of the fruit with me and speak to me about them. There are also a couple of mature trees at the entrance of Wyoming Cemetery on the south side of Pawpaw. Here we are in the cemetery, looking north along this fence line. As I eventually pan to the west, you'll see the two trees on either side of the entrance drive. And that will signal the end of our video. Consider liking and subscribing for more pawpaw-related content. I'm Austin Cliff. Thank you for watching. And next time, we'll look at some pawpaw grafting.